Labor laws are extremely complicated and broad. And we were fortunate a number of years ago to have a guest lecturer in the class named Jim Bogart. And Jim Bogart came to Salinas as a young attorney and took a job with the Grower Shipper Association. And he became the president of the Grower Shipper Association and helped them for years with legal issues and supported the agriculture businesses, agriculture industry, and actually started here to help with legal representation during the 1970s, the years that started to really get the Farm Workers Union, UFW, and Cesar Chavez a lot of successes and attention. And so that is why he ended up in Salinas in the beginning. So Jim was in our class to talk about, from his perspective as a leader of the Grower Shipper Association, what his views on agricultural labor law looked like. Now, it says here he's the Grower Shipper Association president, and I'm not going to change the slide. It actually is now past president. Jim retired, and he's done a tremendous amount of work in this area, in California in general, for the ag industry. And so I want to give you some of the things from his perspective and some of the details about some of the topics that I already have discussed with you in the previous labor law PowerPoint. So labor and employment laws and regulations affect damn near everything imaginable in the ag industry. Now, you could pause on that previous slide to get some ideas that you might want to dig into. Maybe something here is something that triggers an interest on your side, and you want to write your term paper. Talk about a broad range of topics. You could look into any of these for your own term paper, but it's a huge, broad area. And he just touches on the tip of the iceberg. That list is actually just off the top of his head. He just typed it up real quick, the things that he has to deal with. So the Grower Shipper Association started in the 1930s, way before Jim. And it actually became an organization that grew into existence because of a labor strike at that time. And so a staff of about 4 people work there right now. So it's just a small advisory, informational, and legal resource for the Central Coast ag community, with about 500 members in the ag industry. And it serves primarily the Tri-County area, but it also supports the ag industry in other areas as well. And there's a lot of organizations that farm here in the Salinas Valley or some nearby area, and they also farm in Yuma, Arizona, for example, Imperial Valley, California, all of that. So it doesn't stop at the borders of our Tri-County area. Again, Jim Bogart was president, general counsel, and he came on board in 1979. And so that was later in the era. This was not in the heat of the Cesar Chavez years. That really started and gained most attention, but it continued. It didn't stop all of a sudden, 75, 76, and it all happened in one explosive series of events. It was ongoing for a number of years. But Uh, there were lots of strikes that continued throughout the mid 70s into the 80s, and rightfully so. Don't get me wrong on anything I may have said. I totally support the workers' strikes and the efforts of the UFW. I think some of the things that happened in the ag industry are quite embarrassing and illegal and unethical. Uh, and sometimes it takes a lot of pressure to get things to change, for social justice reforms to actually occur. So the whole idea of workers' rights and coming to grips with California state and U.S. federal laws dealing with workers' rights, getting everything to work well together, and the unions or the non-union workers and the businesses to find common ground to get the ag industry work done. Also, food safety, largely starting in 2006 with an E. coli outbreak in 2006. There was actually a previous one that arguably could have started it in 2005. It kind of was the wake-up call, and people started paying attention in 2005, but it really exploded with the following year, yet another E. coli bacterial outbreak in leafy greens that put food safety on the map, on the international map, as well as in the psyches of the American public, that started to really pay attention. Water and the ag waiver. Water is always a legal issue. There's a saying that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. And in agriculture, there's so much truth to that. In any place, the ag has a huge water demand, but that doesn't mean they're stingy and selfish and the industry is pulling water because they want all of it for themselves. Everybody needs to eat. Our whole existence as a species is dependent upon food, shelter, and clothing. And we are all in that battle together. And how do we solve the problems of food, shelter, and clothing? The biggest portion of that starts with agriculture. So we all are responsible to support agriculture, no matter what industry we're interested in. And we all have to be accepting of the fact that we need water to run agriculture because we all need it to survive. Now, can ag industries be more efficient with water? Absolutely. But they don't waste water indiscriminately. Water's expensive, and it's become more expensive, and there's more pressure. So the kind of water waste that we may have seen in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s is tightening up. There's much less waste, and the industry is doing a lot better. Could we do better still? Of course we can. There's always things you can do to incrementally improve what you're doing, but it's not just about water quantity. It's not about water conservation. It's also about water quality. And the pesticides and fertilizer runoff that gets into the water or goes down into our water table for the well water. Lots and lots of issues going on. We'll talk about water at a later time. And then access to legal farm labor. The emphasis on legal, because if you don't have a right to work because you don't have a green card or visa, worker visa status, or something that would allow you to work, citizenship being the most obvious, but if you don't have that, you're not considered legal farm labor. And that's been getting more and more tight over the years. And these things have largely remained the same, with the exception of food safety, throughout what I would say the last 40 years. It's these issues with food safety being about the last 15 of those years. So what are the current priorities? Water and the ag waiver, which is another class topic, as well as access to labor are the two top ones at the moment. In the era of 2006 to maybe 2016, I would say it spent 10 years probably at the top of the list. Food safety was it. And I think it's become a little more routine, a little more understood, accepted. Companies have figured it out. It's still crucial. It's still important. There's still a lot of work to do, but it's not the same urgent priority that it was before. It's slipped into third place because companies have largely figured it out and are working with it and don't have nearly as many urgent issues related to food safety as they used to. So, what about your legal right to work? There is the Legal Workforce Act of 2013, introduced by Lamar Smith of Texas. And that was an amendment to the Workplace Security Act of 2010. And if it went through in its entirety without change, the main thrust of this proposed law was to make E-Verify mandatory for all employers throughout the United States. And immigration, worker, labor, green card issues are just hot potato issues, and they have been for a while now. And it's been almost a topic that can't even reach the level of discussion, I would say, in the last 5-6 years. It's such a hot potato topic, and there's so many other things going around. It's dropped to a background issue. It's important to a lot of people, but the problem is, if you were to make E-Verify absolutely the law of the land without making other changes, it would be devastating for our labor force, because we don't have a way to make some of the workers that would be ineligible under E-Verify to make them eligible through some other program, like a guest worker program of some sort. The ag industry would arguably be the hardest hit, and it's also one of the dominant industries, one of a small handful of industries that depend on migrant and non-legal worker production. And unfortunately, and I find this to be an embarrassment, it's not that the workers aren't there. It's not that they wouldn't be willing to do what is necessary to be a legal worker. It's that in this country, we have a horrible situation where we're fighting about these issues in a way that's about politics and not about getting the work done, about respecting people and getting people to work. And we should have a guest worker program, but there's so much racism and anti-immigrant sentiment among some in this country that we can't even have the discussion without it breaking down into some BS set of lies. Anyway, it is a problem. And E-Verify is being used more and more. Companies every year are deciding to opt in because it's working great. But in the ag industry, it is a problem. So currently in California, I-9s are used by a lot of companies, and you still can use them. Before this bill, there was the Immigration Reform and Control Act by President Reagan, passed to control and deter illegal immigration. It legalized many undocumented workers, so a lot of people were for it because it gave this kind of one-stop, one-time pass to undocumented workers. It legalized certain ag workers. It provided sanctions for employers who knowingly hire undocumented workers. I really haven't seen that put into practice very often, but it technically did. The I-9 form was the primary means of compliance back in '86, but it's now just one of two options. I-9 versus E-Verify. The I-9 forms, employers must examine the documents provided with the I-9 forms. If the documents appear legitimate, then the employer is in compliance, period. And as a human resources specialist, you're not a document expert. You don't have to go to great lengths. You shouldn't go to great lengths to try to verify the documents. Do they look legitimate? Does the information match? Done. Going any further to verify employee status opens up the employer to a possible lawsuit. So with an I-9, you look at the documents. If they give you a driver's license or social security card that looks legit, you log the number, done. You hire the employee if you choose. With E-Verify, it links the social security number to a name, and the employers become liable once an employee is flagged in the system. So if the employee is flagged, they no longer can work for you, or you can't hire them in the first place. Sometimes people get flagged after the fact, and that could be because it was later found that they were not properly documented, or they were a victim of identity theft or some other identity fraud. I know quite a few people. I had one worker that shared the Social Security with another family member. So they were working here in Salinas under their Social Security number, and it was their Social Security number, but their cousin was working in, I think it was in Yuma, under the same Social Security number. Can you get away with that? On an I-9, yes. On a E-Verify, that no longer will work. It is estimated that 50 to 70% of ag workers are undocumented. And that's a lot of people. And so there needs to be a way to do that. There isn't any people willing and capable to do this work. We've been through that in the past where people say you're stealing jobs from Americans. Well, not in ag. That's not true. There might be some argument for that in some industries like construction. That certainly does happen where undocumented, untrained construction workers are stealing jobs from union workers that are being unemployed. That's a different issue, not going there, but that argument is made in agriculture and it doesn't hold water. People have put out jobs in the past, in some cases, huge efforts in the state of California to get people to work for these ag jobs. And nobody shows up. Nobody shows up. Nobody will take these jobs. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to go into the politics and the psychology of it, but the idea that undocumented workers are stealing jobs from Americans in agriculture is not a valid argument. So what do? If we totally implement E-Verify, that's over 2 million jobs cut right away. Where do we fill those jobs? How do we fill those jobs? Who's going to do those jobs? What happens to the families of those 2 million people? It's just unconscionable. We need a solution that makes sense. So Lamar Smith retired in 2019, and E-Verify is part of his legacy that he left behind after retiring a couple years ago. The opponents, the people against E-Verify, are very reluctant to address the issue due to the current political climate. And that's been true, like I said, for probably 6 years now, at least 7 years maybe. So it's just kind of boiling on the back burner, and E-Verify is just sitting there. In California, our Representative Lundgren was approached to write a bill for a temporary guest worker program. I think that was about 2015. I can't remember when that exactly happened, but There was no way that was going to get off the ground. No way. Also, there's something called the H-2A visa program, and that is an alternative where you can get H-2A visas for people, but that's not enough. The program isn't efficient enough and doesn't have the capacity to replace ag workers, and it's got some problems. It doesn't work well in the ag industry in a lot of positions or in high volume. If E-Verify goes into effect, H-2A visas cannot possibly fill the gap. So H-2A visas are an alternative to I-9 forms. You provide this legal status, legal to work using the H-2A visa program, but it's extremely cumbersome, hard to do. It's not efficient at all. And some of the H-2A visa program has been abused by certain industries. I would argue that the computer and software industries have totally abused the program, because rather than hiring an unemployed computer programmer in the United States for, you know, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 salary that they should earn, they can get an H-2A visa person from India and pay them $40,000. That's not what the H-2A visa is for. It's not so you can save money and get workers because they're cheap. It's supposed to be when you can't get workers, there's nobody left unemployed. You've hired all of the unemployed people and you're left with no recourse. Then you can go to the H-2A visa program. The H-2A visa program only accounts for about 2% of the ag labor force in California, a very small percentage. The Department of Labor also targets H-2A visa employers. So if you get an H-2A visa, all of a sudden you become a target of investigation by the Department of Labor, which totally screws up the whole process. Now, in higher paid jobs, you kind of can get away with it in the tech industry because you've got higher paid employees, you've got the attorneys, you've got everything. But for the ag industry, this is a disaster. If you don't have H-2A employees, the average is about 8% audit rate. 8% of the ag industry companies get audited. Unless you hire anybody with an H-2A visa, then all of a sudden your whole company is under Department of Labor audit at a 30% rate, nearly 4 times as high a rate of audit. That's just BS, strong arm tactics of the federal government, anti-immigration practices, and this has gone on through multiple administrations. H-2A visas require the employers to provide housing, which is great, right? Not always. There are a number of companies along the Arizona, New Mexico, Texas border, California border, where employers hire people that might live in border towns. In Tijuana, Mexicali, San Luis, Mexico, and they cross the border in the morning, go to work, go back home at night. You still have to provide housing. Just because they have other housing doesn't mean that you don't have to provide it. So the H-2A visa program leaves vacant housing. It's a disaster. You can't rent that housing. It's very expensive and a waste. There are other situations where people have family members. They don't want the H-2A visa housing. They've already got something set up right here in Salinas. They want to live with their uncle because it's a perfect situation, and they don't want the H-2A visa apartment. Anyway, I've been in some of these H-2A visa housing developments, and they're small, but they're very well maintained, very clean, very well managed in my observation and from people that I've spoken to that live there. So it is a great solution sometimes, but the red tape and the requirements can be a problem at other times. So where will we find workers? This kind of is the exclamation point on something I said earlier. There was a welfare to work program where Dianne Feinstein in the late 90s here in California offered 100,000 jobs to people who were unemployed, who were collecting welfare, trying to give them an opportunity to earn money. 100,000 job openings in agriculture. 3 people showed up to get jobs. And I think 2 of them quit almost immediately after finding out what working in ag is really like. The people who grew up in ag, I don't care what color your skin is, what your background is, ag is hard work. And for somebody on unemployment from another industry, it's an eye opener. You go out there with a hoe in your hand thinning lettuce, it's hard work. You're harvesting strawberries, it's hard work. So there is no quick fix. E-Verify in Georgia. Georgia implemented an E-Verify program, and immediately, boom, 65% of the ag workforce was lost because of E-Verify. Crops were rotting in the fields. Emergency plans approved to create a prisoner release program. And within days, the prisoners were saying, send me back to prison. We don't want to work in the fields. No way. And it was a disaster. I don't remember what year this was. 2015, maybe. You can look it up. It's not a big deal. I will never ask you, when was it? But it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't recently either. But still, it showed the disaster when E-Verify is broadly implemented in states that have large agricultural production. It shows a huge magnifying glass on that problem that we have. And unfortunately, the same business owners that tend to be very conservative, that are talking about the policies that could easily be argued as anti-immigrant policies, it's the same people that will turn right around after talking badly about immigration, will turn around and say, we need these workers. How are we going to get them? So for example, the hospitality industry, the major hotel chain, massive amounts of highly conservative people own the major hotel systems across our country. Yet who's working in their kitchens and providing maid service and bellhop service? A lot of them is undocumented workers. So you can't have it both ways. We need a solution. So at the same time, all of this is happening with E-Verify. Enforcement is ramping up. It has been for quite some time. It goes up and down. There's social security mismatches, so the system isn't perfect. If E-Verify kicks you out, it doesn't matter if there's a glitch in the computer system. You're out. You can't be hired. You got to find a way to fix it. And that's really hard, especially if somebody is trying to work and they don't have a lot of money, they don't have a lot of resources, they don't know where to turn. So we need to do something. The grower shipper's position is that if they want to implement E-Verify, fine. Just don't do it alone. You need a guest worker program of some sort that makes sense. You need to be able to provide an opportunity for people to work. And when properly informed, 70% of voters approve a guest worker program. And unfortunately, it's how you ask the question. A lot of people say, people are against this guest worker program. Well, what question did you actually ask? The question might be, should the United States bend over backwards to give jobs to illegals who don't have legal status to even be in this country, or who illegally came to this country and broke our laws? Well, you say that and people say, no, we shouldn't just give people jobs who break our laws. But that's a disingenuous statement. And people come and ask these questions in a survey and they lie about what's really going on. And the reality is that the vast majority of undocumented workers came here because of companies wanting them to come here, jobs, and they did everything they can to help provide for their family. They're wonderful people trying to do their best. There's this bait and switch BS in the United States where you can be here for this, but not for this. And it's a mess. And we should stop that mess and help people work legally, open, out in the open, proper guest worker status, pathway to citizenship, whatever. Our immigration policies in this country are a joke. So what happens if we don't act? Well, the economic forces are pushing already. That forces increased imports, which has a problem with our trade deficit, which is already too high. Food costs are increased because we have to bring things in from other countries, which always ends up costing more in the long run, and labor costing more for domestic production. Increased problems with food safety, food security, loss of our skilled workforce, and indirect costs to our communities. It's a disaster. These are our family and friends that get screwed up in this. And, I know quite a few people that would be really messed up with E-Verify and no guest worker program. And I feel very bad for people that I know that I call friends that maybe you're one of them. What do they do? How much stress do they have to endure about possible loss of employment, possible uh, retaliation, maybe even getting kicked out of the country? So I'm going to take a really quick break